Okay, well, welcome to everybody to this, the fourth of our public lectures, part of the series Big Data and Big Questions. I'm Hussein Kassim from Politics, co-convening the series. It's a real pleasure to welcome an old friend and former colleague, Helen Margetts, to talk to us this evening. Helen is probably the leading writer on e-government, digital government in the UK, so it's a great pleasure to have her here. She is the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, a multidisciplinary centre in that university with people from 9 different disciplines, I think that she was saying before. She is also director of Society of the Internet. She's written a number of key books relevant to the field. One is about the use of digital tools in government, one with Christopher Hood and one by yourself. And then more recently this year, she's written about political mobilisation in the digital governance era. And I think we're going to hear a bit of that somewhere towards the talk. So please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Margetts.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussein. It's really nice to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about big data, obviously, as that's what the series is about. But I'm going to talk about social big data. That is, big data that pertains to human beings. Around about 80% of big data is supposed to relate to human beings, although that's one of those kind of consultancy type statistics, which you wonder how on earth anybody calculated it. And I'm going to talk about how big data is used for policy making and by government and other public sector organisations. In some sense, that means being a bit kind of speculative, because part of what I want to talk about is the fact that in general, government lags behind other sectors in making use of big data, in either generating it or using it or building into policy making. And perhaps that is one of the kind of difficult questions for government in the age of big data that we might discuss at the end. So I'll say a little bit about the changing context of policy making before I start talking about big data. The reason for that is that I believe that one particular kind of societal shift, i.e. the intertwining of life and society with digital technologies, is bringing us big data, but also bringing some quite important changes to the context of public policy making, those kind of twin trends. And you can't talk about one without talking a little bit about the other. I'll talk about some of the possibilities for policy making. I'll give some sort of examples scattered from various places in the world and sectors. And then I'll talk about some of the challenges. So I'm going to give the positive kind of be happy type view to start with, and then I'll come in with the problems. So if you're thinking, oh God, she's got a kind of Pollyanna type view of big data, it's not quite like that. I'm just kind of doing one. I'm giving it the best chance possible first. Okay, so just stepping back for the moment, I wanted to show this graph just because it shows how, I guess we might sort of feel that use of the percentage of populations across the world online is a relatively sort of stable thing by now, and that we don't have to kind of think about that anymore. And I just wanted to show this graph, which, by the way, should be updated every time I give a presentation, but because it's still changing very quickly. That's the point I'm trying to make. So even though we're relatively used to the idea that in North America we're really sort of heading towards, I don't know why it's doing that, we're almost heading towards universal penetration at above 80%. There are some people who are still not online, but that percentage is really getting smaller and is still getting smaller all the time. There was a time when we thought it kind of stabilised, but with the introduction of smartphones, that has changed again. And in all the other continents of the world, but look at the figures in Africa, for example, which are really, have hit 20% already after 2014 when this graph was produced. We're still in a position where internet penetration is rising pretty rapidly, and people are spending more and more of their lives in online environments. And the point I want to make here, that gives us a new kind of political weather, if you like. It changes the context in which policy making takes place. Why is that? Well, while people are playing out their lives on platforms like social media platforms or government interfaces or company portals, they are being invited all the time to undertake kind of tiny acts of participation in pursuit of policy change. So while you're on Facebook or Instagram or any platform like that, you are at certain points being invited to sign a petition, to like something, to share something, to retweet something, maybe to download a video. And these kind of tiny acts are what's qualitatively different about the digital world in political terms. That is, that very tiny acts like this weren't possible before. If you were if you wanted to protest against the fate of Syrian refugees on a Greek island before the existence of social media, that would have been you'd have had to be quite dedicated to that cause to really register your protest or register your view of what policy should be. On social media, you can do that very, very easily. And I would argue that that's drawing people who wouldn't have expressed an opinion about policy or undertaken some act of participation into the kind of policy process, only in a tiny way, but those tiny ways can scale up to something quite important, some kind of quite important mobilization for policy change. They usually don't. Most campaigns for policy change, most political campaigns go absolutely nowhere and fail completely. But some of them do scale up to something important. And when they do that very quickly. I'll just show you some pictures which kind of illustrate that. But the key point I'm trying to make is that this makes the policy-making environment more unstable, more confusing, more unpredictable, more difficult to know what's going to happen. So strange things happen in this kind of environment. Jeremy Corbyn gets elected as the Labour Party leader out of nowhere. Donald Trump becomes a serious contender for the Republican nomination. Things like that happen in this environment, and that's a challenge to policymaker. So, as I said, the kind of thing I'm talking about is just signing a petition, liking something, following something. And even if you do one of those things, there's an instant opportunity to share it with hundreds of people across the world. So if you sign a petition, you can immediately share it with large numbers of people on a platform like Twitter. Just a photograph like this, if you think that might seem, just sharing a photograph on Facebook might seem like a tiny kind of, very tiny thing to do. But isn't there an argument that photograph of a German football stadium welcoming refugees may have actually changed the course of people's lives as they hear about it and hear the kind of policy context in Germany. If you want to know more about this kind of argument, it is in the book that Hussein mentioned called Political Turbulence, How Social Media Shape Collective Action. You might think that that's one of the books that you can, you don't have to read because it's all in the title, the arguments in the title, and that is true to some extent, but honestly there's a lot more there. Do take a look. But I just want to borrow from that book this key point, that you get a scaling up of these tiny acts of participation on a very small number of occasions. Most of them fail completely, and that's making the policy environment more unstable. That one there is a picture of every single signature to every petition to the UK government petitions platform over the past few years. What it basically shows is that, petition signing is incredibly popular very large chunk of the population have signed some petition or other in pursuit of policy change. And here, the yellow ones are the ones that have got over 100,000. So in the UK, if you get over 100,000 signatures, then you get you get a debate in the House of Commons. All the others have failed. As I said, 99% of them have failed even to get 500 signatures. And what this graph shows is that three of those petitions are all in pursuit of the same change, i.e. to stop the badger cull. Obviously, in the British context, you need something in pursuit of saving a cute animal is the place to look if you want to find extensive activity. Three petitions there, one of them bombed out completely, only a handful of signatures, one of them a medium amount of signatures, and one going right over 100,000. It's the logarithmic scale on the left, so that explains why that's so much higher, the one at the top. Here's another example. Here we've just selected the petitions to the UK government on refugees and migrants. A nice example there of this kind of swathes of opinion expressed in these acts of participation, basically for and against the acceptance of asylum seekers and increased support for refugee migrants in the UK. So there you've got two petitions getting over 100,000, one to stop allowing immigrants into the UK and one to accept more asylum seekers and increase support for refugee migrants in the UK. And all those others are recent petitions campaigning, expressing some kind of policy view on the situation in Europe on refugees and migrants. So that's the context that policymakers are operating in. Rapid, quick-moving mobilizations, most of which fail, some of which get very large numbers of support and effect policy change. It's difficult to imagine that the UK government's policy on refugees would have changed this last summer if it hadn't been for actions like this, and most notably perhaps the sharing of a photograph of a drowned Syrian boy. This is an example of a similar phenomenon in the US. These are all mobilizations against perceived racist policing in the US to hashtags like Black Lives Matter, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, I Can't Breathe. All of them representing very rapid mobilization, going up very quickly. And as we all know, those campaigns about successive incidents of incidents where black lives have been lost in custody or at the hands of police, all of them happening very, I mean, these are the successful ones. Again, there were lots from the past which haven't succeeded. But you can see here now a sustained activity every time one of those incidences take place. Sometimes going up when somebody dies, and then again when there's been failure to indict the police. But that's the kind of context in which judicial decisions are now operating in the US. So what I'm arguing there is that the possibility of tiny acts of participation that digital life basically offers people as they go about their daily lives is creating a new kind of context. It's creating a new political weather for policy making. And that's going to influence the way that policy is made. It's going to influence policymakers' decisions. It makes policy making more difficult, basically. It makes it more confusing and more unpredictable. At the same time, it also generates the kind of data that might help to understand it. And that's what I meant when I said that the same phenomenon brought both new political weather and new ways of understanding or even predicting the political weather. So digital lives generate big data. Even just driving here to Norwich to meet you, I generated a cornucopia of data by having my phone attached to my windscreen, telling me where to go. Whenever I stopped, I checked my email, had a quick look at Facebook and Twitter. What an amazing quantity of data about just one person generated in just 3 hours. And we're all doing that all of the time. All of you checking email on your phones right now, even not by doing that, your phone is generating some sort of data. And this, I mean, I don't know how many people in the room are social scientists. I don't know how many of you are policymakers. But for both those kind of groups, we've got data like we've never, ever had before. And Hussein tells me that every speaker has kind of given a definition of big data. And I guess I don't see the point in me sort of offering another one, and we discuss whether that's really what big data is. So there's just the normal one from Wikipedia, data sets so large that a normal desktop computing environment can't cope with it. But what I really want to say is kind of what's exciting about it for me, what I think is exciting about big data, and what you and what perhaps the people in this audience would think was exciting about big data. And that is the idea of having large quantities of real-time transactional data rather than survey data. That this is data about what people really do and really think. So as a political scientist, I know very well that with a survey of what people thought they did or thought they might do, it's not even possible to recreate an election result from an election that happened yesterday. People will tell you what they think they voted, or they will tell you what they would like to have voted, or what they think you want them to say they voted, or what they would have voted if they'd actually gone to vote, which actually they didn't do, but they don't want you to know that. So even recreating the past with survey data, as I'm sure everybody here knows, is a difficult thing to do. And what we're talking about with big data is we're talking about real-time transactional data, which, although has always been present in retail, is present in some parts of government, has not really been available in the wider context of the sort of outside world transactional data of what people did. And that's an exciting shift, I think. And of course, that data can relate to a whole population, not a sample. And that's also an exciting phenomenon. However, of course, that's a very rosy picture, but big data in general, we know no demographics, we don't know anything about who people were. We might know where they came from, we might know where they're going, but we don't know any of the things, any of those, all those lovely demographics and everything that we know from a survey. And so, of course, that means that our whole way that we might incorporate data into policy making or into the way that we think as social scientists about public policy in a research context has to kind of shift, because it is a completely different sort of data that we're getting hold of. But it does at least hold the potential of providing a new source of information about what citizens need, of their preferences, of how they behave, of how they really behave. It could facilitate all kinds of new forms of policy making. If you think of, for example, education data, if you have enough data generated by pupils and teachers as they go about their daily business, it's quite possible that you could end up with enough data to know with almost certainty who's going to drop out of a course, who's not going to make it through, who's going to end up being excluded, who's going to end up going to a top university with the highest grades imaginable. If you can work that out, what should you do with that information? This is really it's not an unheard of way of thinking about policy making, because we've always faced those dilemmas those dilemmas have always really been faced in health policy, haven't they? I mean, the idea that somebody is terminally ill, what kind of resources do you put into someone who's terminally ill, somebody who's very young as opposed to very old? Those ideas, those kind of dilemmas have always been tackled in the health field, but I think we're seeing those writ large right across other sectors as well, education just being one of them. This kind of data can actually be solicited. Feedback, complaints can actually be solicited very easily on social media. On social media, again, generating a new sort of data that policymakers had before. There should be ways in which this kind of data can inform a sort of government self-improvement. That could be by soliciting things like complaints. It could be looking at differences between different parts of the country or different local offices or different hospitals, different schools. All the time, institutions like that are generating data which wasn't there before. They're generating data in social media. They're generating data on social enterprise platforms or citizen portals like Mumsnet or something like that. There is data out there which is telling you something about the quality of services and therefore possibly offering a chance of improvement. They can be used in emergencies and disasters. I'm sure all of you will have read and even used the kind of facilities that Facebook, for example, used its own data to generate during the tragic events of last Friday and the aftermath. And there is the possibility of this kind of data being used for prediction. I talked about the political weather, and over time, I mean, just to extend that metaphor a bit, meteorologists have, over time, got better at predicting the weather with big data. There might be a read across for policy making and social behaviour which can allow new forms of prediction, and I'll say something about that in a minute. So just to go for a few examples. Here's the United Nations Global Pulse. Some of you will probably have seen that, maybe even used that. That's an example that uses mobile phone data for disaster management, for example. Disaster management has been a really significant area where big data has been used both to sort of garner, to kind of help people to cope with a disaster, to match up lost relatives, for example, to get supplies or emergency services to where they're needed, but also to thereby gather more data and feed it back to people on the ground. Here's an example of a prediction. This is using Wikipedia data to predict the Iranian election back in 2013, done by my colleague and co-author Taha Yasseri, who's in fact a physicist. There's been, I don't know if any of you have seen work on using Twitter data to predict box office sales. There's been a lot of talk about how Twitter can be used to predict what happens. Actually, Twitter is really bad at predicting things. You can't predict. Political scientists here will perhaps have seen the articles that use Twitter to predict the last election result. Some of them, rather unwisely in my view, rushed to publication before the election to show that they were right before the event, thereby making it rather more exposed how tragically wrong they were. There's no, I mean, you know, I don't want to exaggerate the possibilities of prediction, but actually Wikipedia has actually got quite a bit more hope, and I'm talking about viewing here, not editing. The viewing data on Wikipedia is freely available. It's completely available forever, you know, the entire viewing history on Wikipedia. It's a very underutilized source of kind of free big data. Anyway, Taha assures everybody that he did predict the result of the Iranian election, which was very badly predicted in the polls before the election, and it is there on his Facebook page to prove it. Here's an example of a kind of model of the data that I showed you earlier about petitions. We scrape the petitions platform of the UK and the US governments every hour. We've done it for several years now, and we have actually confessed up to it now, so I can say that that's what we do. We didn't actually necessarily ask in advance. I mean, we don't collect any names or anything like that, just the act of signing. What you can do with that data is kind of model the extent to which attention to a petition kind of fades away, and in fact it decays incredibly quickly. One of the observations I made earlier was how quickly a petition succeeded, if it was going to succeed. Things that succeed very quickly indeed, and this shows the converse of that how quickly the attention to something decays very quickly. And this is actually a model of collective attention decay, and shows that if a petition hasn't made it in about 10 hours, it's probably going to be just kind of digital dust. You can use data to understand political institutions. This is an analysis by my colleague Jonathan Bright, who analysed 75 years of parliamentary debates, showing the rate that speakers are interrupted by other MPs, showing or arguing that we're developing a more contentious political climate over time. I think most of us kind of feel that anyway, but there's the data to suggest that that really is the case. This is, I think you've already had, there has been a lecture in this series on smart cities. So this is another smart city. This is the Centre of Operations in Rio de Janeiro, which I visited this year. This is an interesting example, a really determined effort to make use of big data to make a city a safer and better place to live. It was kind of motivated by massive floods in 2010, where many homes sort of slid down the hills that surround Rio de Janeiro, parts of the favelas that slid down the hills. A lot of loss of life, tragic events basically, and the pledge was made not to let that happen again. This is an extraordinary place. In fact, it's in some ways it seems it's modelled on NASA more than anything. And in fact, all the people working there wear these kind of white jumpsuits, kind of NASA style type jumpsuits, surrounded by screens, surrounded by data, bringing in data from all different sources. In fact, a lot of the people in the local government of the city actually work in the Centre of Operations. In some ways, you might find it quite, I mean, there's something in a way scary about it. In a way, it seems to embody some of the kind of worst nightmares, perhaps, of a kind of surveillance state. But actually, I think it is generally perceived. If there's any people from Brazil here, maybe they can add opinions. But it does seem to be perceived as something that is actually doing good in the city, that it is helpful in, for example, managing traffic congestion. Drawing in data from all kinds of sources, both private sector applications, traffic management apps, for example, and city data, bringing it all together and analysing it in a big data way. This is a feasibility study that we carried out for the Department of Work and Pensions, and really this is quite tentative. It's only a suggestion of what might be done. But I wanted to use it as an example. It's available online. It was published eventually by the Department of Work and Pensions. But the aim of this was to just try and understand how people were perceiving the forthcoming benefit change and the introduction of universal credit, the biggest change to the UK benefits system probably since it was created. Because these big changes were being introduced, but there was very little kind of understanding of what people thought about it, what people were worried about, where people were finding information from. And what we wanted to do and what we suggested to the department that we did was just try and gut social media for what we could find, from what we could find out. So, for example, we looked at the Google search. We looked at the Google Search API. Looked at where people were searching for and where they were finding information on universal credit. One of the interesting things we found out in that piece of analysis was that actually there was at least a month where the thing that people were coming up with was a site called universalcredit.co.uk, which was actually a private sector site, a site over which the department had no control, on which the information was not necessarily right and probably wasn't there. Things like that, quite easy to find out if you go out to look for it. That's quite important information about how people are kind of experiencing that particular department. We looked at Wikipedia data. We were able to identify the point at which universal credit was actually being looked at more than job seekers' allowance, the legacy benefit. That's showing you that interest is growing and that people are starting to seriously sort of think about that. It's one indicator. We also looked at universal credit on Twitter. This was quite an interesting point because we weren't. You could see that it was actually becoming something of concern even on Twitter, which after all, by no means all of the population on Twitter, not nearly as significant as the bedroom tax. We weren't actually allowed to use the word bedroom tax in the report. It's a banned word in the department. We had to call it removal of the spare room subsidy. But I mean, you can see at that point it's starting to hit the kind of controversial level in Twitter terms. Just some indications there, which I think are a pointer to the kind of indications that government departments right across the board might start to be thinking about. Getting new insight into how citizens are experiencing the state, drawing in data, and of course that should be the massive amounts of transactional data that departments have. This is social media data. It'll only really start to have meaning once you actually start trying to put it together with other aggregate sources of data that might be generated inside by a department's internal operations. That might lead you to a different sort of model of government, a kind of model where data is collected at the centre of a department, like the Department of Work and Pensions, and then fed out to local offices to aid delivery. That's the kind of model that large corporations like Walmart, we don't always use Tesco's as the big example anymore, owing to the Tesco's recent fate, but I mean large supermarkets would tend to have that model of dealing with data. That's the kind of mirror image of most governments actually outside Scandinavia. But this kind of data does offer the possibility of that kind of model. Obviously, as I said, you have to start thinking about how to put those data sources together with transactional data. You need there's not enough data there. There wasn't, when we did this study, there wasn't enough data out there about universal credit, which had barely started to be rolled out, to start looking at some kind of regional analysis or looking at geocoded data, but now might be the time to do that, to start looking at specific local problems and issues. But it did make us think about all the other sorts of data that you might use to think about how people were experiencing universal credit, kind of tin openers, if you like, where you could identify the beginnings of concern or the beginnings of worrying trends. One of those things might be the petitions data that I was talking about earlier. There's an actual map of all petition signing to all petitions relating to the Department of Work and Pensions, which gives you a little bit of an idea kind of which parts of the country are worried about what's going on at DWP. And as universal credit gets rolled up, that's something that you might match with that kind of data. I want there to be time for discussions, I'm going to move on. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I mean, one important thing to note about any big data analysis, I think, is that getting causal inference from big data, understanding kind of cause and effect is going to be a very difficult thing to do without thinking about some kind of experimental approach, at least to test any cause and effect you might observe or want to observe. One way to tackle that issue is to look for natural experiments in data, and that is something that we tried to do in terms of there was a change to the petitions platform, the UK government petitions platform, where they introduced trending information for the first time. Thought it would be a good idea to tell people what were the kind of top 6 petitions. They didn't think that would make any difference to what people signed or anything, but they thought it would be a kind of cool thing, make it look a bit more cool. It certainly didn't look very cool at the time. So that did present a sort of natural experiment, if you like, where we could look at the data before and afterwards and see if it actually did make any difference. If anybody's interested, there's a reference to a paper we wrote about that there. Of course, what we found is it did make a difference. It didn't make people sign more petitions. I mean, it didn't have a sort of general coolness effect. But it did mean that the petitions that were more popular got more popular at the expense of other petitions, a sort of get richer phenomenon that we observe in internet-based environments all over the shop. But it also showed that actually the petitions were sort of presented 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it actually showed that the petitions on the left-hand side got more popular relative to the ones on the right-hand side. So it was actually kind of better to be at number 3 than number 2, which is not exactly the kind of effect you want to have really for a redesign of a platform. That's just a small example about petitions, but it's quite possible that there are all sorts of other examples all over government that it might be worth thinking about. I think where all this is leading, where the general phenomenon of big data is leading to a new field of data science. But with respect to the kind of things I'm talking about, with the possibility of using big data in government and using it for public policy and service delivery, I'd rather call it social data science, because it's data science about people, it's about individuals, it's about society, and it requires kind of knowledge and understanding from the social sciences just as much as it does from the computational and mathematical sciences. So at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is my multidisciplinary department at Oxford that Hussein mentioned, we are building a kind of core of expertise in social data science. And one thing I showed that there, and that's a picture there of Taha Yasseri, the physicist, who's actually a co-author on the book and the producer of some of the images I've shown. So we're a social science department, and Taha was actually, when I became head of the department, when I became director of the department, he was actually the first appointment that I made, or the hiring committee that I was on made. And as I was walking home that night, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? You know, this is a social science department, and we just appointed a physicist. You know, was that a good thing? Have I done something mad? In fact, actually, it's a logical thing to do, and I think we're going to see that writ large right across the social sciences. The fact is that physicists are used to having too much data. They're used to this sort of data. They have models of how to look at it. They have the kind of understanding and mechanisms for modelling networks that this data is involved in. But physicists were the first to turn attention to the structure of the internet, for example. So I think we're going to see more of that. Taha actually has his own research team now and is involved in about 15 collaborative projects. who's involved in a project with Zooniverse, the citizen science platform at Oxford. That's a collaboration with astrophysics. But he's also involved in a collaboration with the Everyday Sexism platform, which where people report incidences of sexism across the world. So everything from astrophysics and the identification of planets to the mapping of sexism across the world. These kind of methods kind of do work in both those areas. I don't believe they work in isolation. I don't think we should just have physicists using this kind of data to make public policy. I think it has to be a multidisciplinary collaboration. But I do think that kind of multidisciplinary collaboration is essential to make use of this kind of data, both for social science research, but also for policy making. And just to add to that, we are one of the partners in the new Alan Turing Institute for Data Science, which was launched last week. I don't know if anybody else here is involved in the Alan Turing Institute. That's a collaboration between 5 universities, including Oxford. But it's also a multidisciplinary collaboration of the mathematical and computational sciences, but also the social sciences and ethics, the ethics of information. And I think that's essential for all those people to be there at the table. I don't think this can be pursued by anyone. The field of data science can be pursued by any one discipline in isolation. I've mentioned ethics a couple of times, but not very much. So I said those sort of bad bits were going to come at the end, and this is almost the end. Almost everything that I've talked about raises big ethical issues, and there's no getting away from that. And I've just listed some of them here. I think that people do talk about the ethical issues of big data, of course they do. But I think that some of the issues get kind of all the coverage, if you like. People talk about privacy a lot, at almost the complete expense of any kind of other ethical issue that big data provokes. And of course, one of them, which I haven't got listed here, was the one I mentioned before, the question of, if you are doing probabilistic policy making, if you are making policy on the basis of being able to statistically determine which student is going to drop out of a course, what ethical guidance do you need for making that kind of decision? There has to be some kind of ethical guidance. Do you devote more resources to a student that's going to drop out, or less resources? New forms of kind of guidance on those kind of issues just because they could come possible. I don't know how many people have seen The Imitation Game, the film about Alan Turing. How many people have seen The Imitation Game? Probably quite a lot. Well, I mean, of course, a key issue in there is that once you break the code, to what extent do you use the code to save lives? How do you trade off kind of lives now against the Germans knowing that you've broken the code and thereby rendering your new knowledge useless? Really big ethical issues, and I think they're going to be writ large across any sort of public policy that uses big data. The question of deficit, the question of the kind of deficit between what people know about how their data is used and how it actually is used. To many people, I think one of the most alarming things about the Snowden revelations was not so much that the data was being collected, but that it was being collected on such a scale that so many people didn't know about, that it was being used in ways that people didn't know about. Issues of consent are huge. What sort of consent should we be trying to look for? Some kind of blanket consent or consent to specific instances? What sort of consent is it really viable to expect to be able to get? Privacy, of course, the issue of de-anonymization has been very well known since 2006, where where AOL released thousands of, a million records, I think they released for research, a million search records for research, and the de-anonymization process of search took about, I don't know, 3 minutes or something. And people had the records were withdrawn. That was the last time that an internet corporation released, you know, a large quantity of data like this for public consumption. But there's also the question of group privacy. If certain ethnic groups or groups defined by age or gender or whatever are identified in data, how can we make sure that that kind of information isn't used for some kind of discrimination or discriminatory treatment? How can we ensure that ethical regulations have any coverage? An awful lot of the use of data or the management or storage of data takes place in other jurisdictions which may be outside the coverage of any ethical regulation. There's always the question of balance, and we're seeing that shift all the time. Surely the events of Friday and the weekend will have once again kind of shifted the kind of internal trade-off that everybody's doing. You know, how much do they mind the fact that all their data is increasingly being held by state agencies, by security and intelligence agencies, against the kind of their perception of an increased threat. That balance is constantly shifting across society. And then there's the question of management of data. Who can access data? Who can use it? Who should audit it? Who can audit it when it becomes so complex that it's almost impossible to understand the nature of data? Who can reuse it? Who owns the intellectual property from any insight that's gained? So I guess I'll end just by going through, just kind of listing what I believe to be the kind of key challenges of the use of social data for policy making. I mean, one, of course, is that government kind of lags behind other sectors. Corporations already on the big data backlash, or have even kind of gone beyond it, whereas government is just starting to appoint the first data scientists are now being appointed across UK government. But there's no doubt the government kind of struggles with this, struggles with the kind of expertise that's necessary. I think we all do. One of the other, I mentioned Taha Yasseri, the other co-author, non-political scientist co-author of our book is someone called Scott Hale. He's the first researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute that's actually got the job title of data scientist. He is headhunted every day. Never call any member of your staff data scientist. Don't do it. But you know, there's a real problem with getting people into this field. It's a bit like the problem there used to be getting computer programmers and systems analysts into government back in the 80s and 90s. The ethical framework, that requires real kind of dedicated research attention. It has to be embedded in the research. That's one of the aims that I personally feel for the Alan Turing Institute. Ethics must be an embedded part of the research. Data availability. We talk about, well, especially me perhaps, talk about, you know, the exciting possibilities of this kind of data. This data is guarded very closely by internet corporations, and that's changing all the time. Facebook data is extremely difficult to get hold of unless you're actually working directly with Facebook, and that's getting more and more difficult all the time. Snapchat, WhatsApp, security services may be able to get data, access to that data, but what about other policymakers and what about researchers? That's a key issue into the future. It's going to get worse with the Internet of Things, which will give rise to whole tranches of sort of proprietary data, which nobody can, with huge commercial value, which nobody's going to be able to get hold of. The reputational problems, any sentence which has got big data and government in it has also got the words big and government in it, and that worries people. There's always a challenge of government using data. there's the question of, there are people who tend to conflate the idea of kind of open data and big data. I haven't talked about open data at all, and I'm not going to now exactly, but I mean, the release of public sector data for reuse in the form of open data, that's great, and it's a kind of very welcome trend within public administration, but it's not necessarily big data. Open data is not necessarily big data, and big data quite often can't be made open. Not if it's personal data about people's benefits transactions. You know, can that data really be anonymised enough for it to be open data? That's a highly debatable question. It didn't work for AOL, and it hasn't really worked for anyone since. I mentioned the question of skills. That is going to be a massive issue in the whole field of data science. Very difficult for policymakers to appoint for policy-making bodies to appoint the right sorts of people. It's a problem in academia too. If I think of the kind of research that I do now, I work in a multidisciplinary department. I started my research career at the London School of Economics. I used to think maybe I'll end up back there somewhere. Someday. I couldn't do the kind of research I do now at the London School of Economics. It wouldn't be possible. I couldn't give a job to a physicist, for example. It'd be very lonely indeed. So we're going to need multidisciplinary, cross-sectoral teams, a kind of network of data science across government and across the research community. I think the question of, researchers working with government is going to be very, very important. And serious confrontation of all the trade-offs that I've mentioned. I mean, if you just think of, just to link it to the most recent events, I mean, if you think of how governments across the world are trying to stop their citizens going to Syria, somehow being tempted to go to Syria and join ISIS. That's happening all across countries all across Europe. Think of the three the three schoolgirls that went to Syria early this year. Now, those three schoolgirls, most likely, if you were able to get all the data, all their social media data, absolutely all their data, in all its intricacy, all their phone data, if you were able to get all that data, you would probably have been able to kind of work out what happened and crucial nodes in their social networks that were the trigger for them actually taking the step of going to Syria. If you were able to get all teenagers' social media data and be able to look at the differences between those who, have gone to Syria and the huge masses that haven't, that would give you even more insight and give you even more predictive power to predict when people might do something like that. But obviously, that's not the society that any of us want to live in. But at what point do you make that trade-off? Where do you think about that balance between the use of data and tackling a key contemporary policy problem? Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, for a really rich and all-encompassing talk. There's now plenty of time for questions, so can I gather questions in threes? So one up here. Could you introduce yourselves as well?
could anticipate what people's concerns were, more information. This is why I'm looking it up online. But of course, it could be, this is a really good thing, and I want to make sure it works. And I was thinking, well, what other examples might there be? I mean, during the leaders' debates, they said that one of the things that really trended was the SNP, and it was sort of partly, can I vote for the SNP when I live in England? But also, what dangers does the SNP represent for me? So I'm actually wondering about the tensions between, the search terms, the trending terms, and what they really mean.
A third question?
I want to remember them though.
Okay. I'm on. You can hear me. James Cornford from the Business School here. There seems to be a kind of contradiction in some of the things you're saying. So you're saying that the state seems to lag behind big business. Yeah, I would have thought that the biggest collection of data scientists in the UK are in Cheltenham, in GCHQ. So it's actually parts of the state that seem to lag behind, and other parts seem to be driving the process, whether we really believe all of the revelations that came out with Snowden. And then the second kind of question I have is about whether, if the internet in some ways decentralized a lot of power, whether big data is actually essentially a kind of centralizing, monopolizing force. And you talked a little bit about winner-takes-all type markets and so on, the way in which control over big data may actually be a kind of centralizing moment after a brief period of decentralization associated with internet technologies in the period from sort of 95 to 2015.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer those. Sorry, if I have a shopping list, once it goes over 3, I have to write it down. And you asked 2 questions, so now it's 4, and I haven't written it down. But I'll go to the first one. I mean, of course, yes. I'm not in any sense kind of recommending that all data should be quantitative, and there is a danger. I think not so much with, I think particularly with visualization, that people will be inclined to read things into it that just aren't there. And the kind of appealing nature of it will encourage policymakers to be. And I think we're already seeing, some very kind of, rather shallow kind of visualizations being used to kind of, to my mind, visualizations almost always kind of provoke more questions than they really provide answers. So, I totally agree about the danger. Actually, although policymakers, yes, are attracted by quantitative evidence, I actually think that governments in general, and the UK government in particular, have an appalling record of feeding data, quantitative data from their own operations into policy making. And that they may be attracted by kind of statistical evidence from outside, but the track record of actually using internal data to inform operations is appalling. And this is part of my kind of lagging sense, because I think corporations are much better at doing that. So, I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you, really, and I think that will be one of the challenges, to stop the kind of superficial, attractive visualizations, kind of the pretty side of big data being used, and also the kind of bigness. We've seen that already with surveys. If people talk about surveys, they're talking about how big it was. And that's a problem, because just because something is really... To me, the interesting thing about big data is the fact that it's real-time transactional data. To me, it's almost, that's what the big means in a way. But that's not how it will be. And you do notice people talking about, petabytes, etc. But I don't think any of this should preclude the use of qualitative data. I mean, in a way, questions of ethics, questions of using experimental methods, for example, to get at any kind of causal inference, I believe to be a sort of have to go hand in hand with any kind with big data developments. So, just as your question was more of a comment, this is more of an agreement than an answer, exactly. So, but I think that's the case. I mean, I think more what we've seen in government is a tendency to sort of run away from it more than for that to happen. Because I think it's been quite scary. It's been quite scary for the traditional kind of professions within government, like the Statistical Service. I think we're beginning to see that's beginning to change now, and they're beginning to sort of, which is what should happen, and they're beginning to sort of embrace developments. But I think we have seen a running away from it rather than running towards it up till now. But basically, I'm agreeing with you. And Sarah's question was about, oh yes, well yes, I mean, of course, the question of how to interpret this kind of data, how to avoid cancelling out, sort of cancelling out effects. Even if you just look at the analytics data from a website, if people spent a long time there, does that mean they were really enjoying themselves and having a great time, or they were getting incredibly frustrated not being able to find what they want? And that's true of any of this kind of data, and we've got to get better at working out, you know, when that kind of effect is in order. I mean, and we have to find ways of using data as kind of signals rather than noise. I mean, if people are looking about universal credit in one area rather than another area, you know, that might suggest a difference between the areas. It might mean that the information in that area provision, the sort of offline provision in that area has been kind of particularly bad or something like that. I mean, that's why I said tin openers, you know, it's just a way of sort of looking inside. It may just be some kind of tentative kind of exploratory. I mean, this kind of data analysis is much more exploratory than the kind we're used to. As social scientists, we're used to the idea of kind of developing a hypothesis, properly structured hypothesis, and going in with the analysis to test it. And that's not this kind of analysis, really. It's much more about looking for patterns and algorithms, and that's a different way of looking at the world. But it does mean that you have to be very careful not to take away the same assumptions for it. For people who don't use the internet, of course, that's always something to remember. Big data can quite easily kind of marginalise the digitally excluded, and that's one of the ethical issues, and perhaps, yeah, I guess that should perhaps have been a kind of separated out on the kind of issues that you might build into an ethical framework, the people who are not in the data. I suppose I was thinking it was there, but you're right, it's not there in some cases. There's some people that are remarkably excluded from data, but there's also people who are overly included. I mean, people who face a lot of social problems and are in poverty and are claiming benefits and have complex, difficult lives actually generate a lot of data. The fact that they don't use the internet doesn't stop them from generating a lot of data. So the converse might also be true, that some people receive sort of too much attention or too much invasion of privacy, or face a disproportionate threat from the ethical issues that I was raising. So it can go the other way. Again, you've got to yeah, you've got to not make assumptions that everybody is reflected in data. In any case, I mean, this is more of a social science point than a policy-making point, but in a way it gets a bad reputation for the whole thing. There's a terrible tendency for research studies to use Twitter data to reach all sorts of conclusions. Why? Because it's really easy to get Twitter data, whereas Facebook data is almost impossible. And that's the main, that's a key reason. And the percentage of the population which are on Twitter is, very much smaller than the percentage of the population that are on the internet. So it really depends whatever data source you're using. You've got to think about, what it represents. One of the phenomenon of big data is that sometimes it represents N equals all. It represents some kind of whole population. But N is very rarely the population that you want. N is much more likely to be something like all the Twitter users or all the people who look at Wikipedia or whatever. And you've always got to remember that. And James's question, I knew I was going to, what were you saying? Oh yes, GCHQ, of course. The best data scientists in government are in GCHQ, no doubt about it. And the intelligence and security services are collecting huge quantities of data. We know that, and we've always known it, and they always have. That doesn't mean that they're doing these kind of things. They're using... It doesn't even mean... of course, we don't know exactly what they're doing. Some of us will know more than others, and some of us will know things that we can't necessarily... basically nobody knows, very few people know exactly what they're doing with this kind of data, but I haven't seen much evidence that data is being used kind of in this kind of way for the social good. It is for the social good in that it's being used to identify wrongdoing, but I'd say it was difficult to know the extent to which it's actually being used to kind of, take the example of the 3 teenage girls who went to Syria. To what extent is it being used to identify the kind of patterns in, say, social media data that would be the triggers for people going to Syria, just as one example. To what extent is it being used for that? I'm not sure. We don't hear about it anyway. We certainly don't hear about it. And it is a completely, that expertise is in the security and intelligence agencies, and it's not in civilian agencies. So, yes, you're right, but only from that respect. But again, in a way, I think a lot of the use of that kind of data in systems like Tempora and Prism, it's a bit like kind of using a haystack to look for needles and then throwing the haystack away or burning the haystack. Certainly if policymakers are to be believed, when policymakers say, they have endlessly gone to endless lengths to reassure us that the data is not being used in the kind of way I'm talking about it. And to some extent, and I know I'm out of line here, but in some ways I wish it was, if you see what I mean. It seems to me a terrible waste that the effort to kind of use that data in an anonymised, ethical way to get social insight to solve social problems would be a very exciting way, and I don't think it is being used in that way.
Are there any more questions for Helen?
I'm a PhD student in environmental science. Now, big data can really enlighten us to human interaction, understanding, and decision making, and can be used to predict society with what you have said earlier. And with this predictive ability comes great power and great responsibility. Certainly when it's concerned with that society, now this would be great. If we lived within an ethical society, we could make our societies run much more efficiently. However, with our current government, which are a tightly closed clique, and the current drive to make freedom for information requests more difficult to obtain, would you trust our government, with all this big data, especially with the close links with private institutions, for example, British media and business?
Well, there are no more hands up, so I'm going to allow Helen to answer that straight away.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract. I mean, certainly if you think of authoritarian regimes, some of the things I was talking about, like being able to predict the political weather and predict mobilization, for example, you know, in some regimes that would be quite a frightening thing. And it is a frightening thing. The idea that they can do that, and to some extent they can. I mean, it's an inevitable consequence of the fact that, you know, the data is available, so they are able to predict it. Can we trust governments with data? Well, I mean, sometimes we can't, and I think we saw that with the NHS data, for example. You know, that was an example where we didn't trust the government with it. That's why we've got no proper system of electronic health records. And where it was generally felt that the data was being used for private gain. And I think society as a whole kind of did feel that that data was being used for private value rather than public value, and they didn't trust it. So in that context, you know, no. In other contexts, I think, and in the security context, actually, I think people do make that kind of trade-off. I don't know if it's trust exactly, but they reckon it's worth the risk. I think people make that trade-off. And that a lot of the concerns over the Snowden revelation actually came from sort of kind of media elites and the research community more than the general public. So in some contexts, yes. I mean, also a lot of this data is data. I mean, I've talked about social media data, and I've talked about some sort of quick wins type data. I haven't really talked about transaction, you know, the operational data of departments. And there are some people here from the, you know, the ESRC Administrative Data Network, and people who, you know, are talking about ways to make that data available for research. A difficult thing to do. But I mean, we've always trusted government with that data. You know, government has that data. We do it so that they can, you know, they collect taxes and they collect taxes and provide the welfare state, and we trust the government to do that. In democratic countries, that's what we do trust the government to do. So, yeah, I mean, I do. I have to. I mean, that's the other trade-off I make for living in a country which, you know, maintains a state and a welfare state. So, you know, I don't know what the alternative is, really. I mean, from my perspective, I'd rather they did something, you know, socially useful with it. I think it is. I think it's a scandal the extent to which data actually doesn't get used to actually make policy better. So, yes, I do.
There's a question at the back here.
Thanks, Helen. Richard Desmond, School of History, UEA. A couple of questions. I can project, that's all right. First is, ask you to future gaze a little bit, and does this, I know you talked about teamwork and the importance of teamwork and everything else, and I know the OI is very good at that. But about individuals and individual researchers, does the social scientist of the future need to be just as much a computing scientist as a social scientist? And alongside
to answer that? Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because I mean, if we think about PhD students, for example, you know, it's difficult to do a PhD as part of a team. So, I mean, to some extent, I think your answer to your question is a bit yes, actually. So we are teaching our PhD students. We're teaching them R. We're teaching them to code, and as soon as we're teaching them visualization, and as soon as we possibly can, we'll be teaching them machine learning. And not all students will have to do that, but I think to come out, you know, to call yourself a social data scientist or a computational social scientist, I think you will have to do those things. You know, later on in someone's academic career, of course, you can work in teams and different people have different skills, but I think, you know, there are research outfits who are going around, you know, teaching civil servants and policymakers how to code, and I think that's no bad thing. I mean, I think one of the problems with any of this, and I mean, I started my first research specialism, as Hussein said, was looking at government's relationship with information technologies and looking at information systems in government. And there, the reason why governments in general, but particularly the UK, have made such a god almighty mess of that, is because they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't understand it, it was scary, they hoped it would go away. The internet, the whole tranches of British government that really hoped the internet would go away. Some of them, I think, are still hoping. And it's the same with data, you know, which is why, you know, in answer to your question about civil servants liking quantitative, you know, I don't quite so much agree about that, because I think they're really, really scared. And, you know, some kind of literacy in terms of the internet, encryption, you know, big data, all these things, I think is really important. So, I mean, that is that's one of our, sort of part of our mission at the OII, is to train the next internet literate generation of policymakers, and I'd hold to that. So yes, to some extent, but they don't have to turn. And the thing is, computational scientists need us as well. I mean, you know, it shouldn't be one way, and I would be terrified of it being the way. There's a lot of engineers out there, and you know, who are doing really, really clever things with data, and a lot of it is completely pointless. So I think it's really, really important that we're there as well to ask the kind of questions. And I go back to the Alan Turing point. You know, I mean, he was the computer scientist, but it was him in the end who wrote the algorithm for the ethical dilemma. It was embedded. It was all part of the same enterprise, and I think that's how it's going to be. Sorry, what was your second question? There were two. Oh, we all had to be thieves. Oh, well, I shouldn't have said that. I mean, yeah, I mean, scraping, that's part of our courses too. We do teach our students to do that. But, I mean, we teach them ethical guidance for it as well, and everything. I mean, you know, we're starting to get, when we started doing this petitions data, it was completely kind of unguided at all by any sort of ethics framework. The university ethics committees didn't know what the hell they were doing. I employed one researcher who was doing his PhD in another department, and in his interview he started explaining to me how happy he was because on this social media platform, you know, been scraping all these names and addresses and everything, and he got this network going, and I was like, what the hell, you know? You know, I don't think that's going on anymore. People have started to get their head around it. But so, yeah, well, we have to, not thieves exactly, but sort of Robin Hood types, maybe.
How do you think you reconcile the kind of the needs for data-driven policymaking, as you suggested, with the needs of kind of the very quick turnaround, the efficient
Well, obviously I'm going to say put some money into the Alan Turing Institute and a master's degree in social data science. Yeah, of course. I mean, those trade-offs have always existed, haven't they? But I mean, really, I mean, big data, data science in the private sector has been sold as a massive, you know, productivity gain and revenue generator. And it's been sold like that for government too. And lots of consultancies have put figures on, you know, how much money government would save if it actually used its data. And I know a lot of that is hype, and I don't know how the heck they would work out those figures. You know, there's a McKinsey report, I can't remember what it was, 500 billion or something, if governments all across the world. I mean, those figures mean nothing. But I do believe that there's huge gains here, really, in financial terms. And, you know, I was talking to a county council last week who came to see me with genuine dilemma. You know, we desperately need to save money. You know, how can we use our data? Not by selling it, but, you know, how can we use our data and our kind of digital platforms to, you know, completely revolutionise our kind of digital presence and our digital channels. And they were talking about, you know, that that was the only thing they could do with their current financial situation. So, you know, yeah, obviously it's different, but difficult. But I mean, I think the policy-making environment is kind of right for that at the moment, in that you've got savage cuts, but you've also got 2,000 more data scientists effectively in GCHQ. They won't really be spies, they'll be data scientists. And how much was it for cybersecurity? You know, so, yeah, and a new institute for coding. I mean, you know, this is, in today's policy environment, this is the kind of thing that will get resources, if anything will, I'd say.
Okay, I've got two announcements before we close, or before we thank Helen. The first is that our next event in this series takes place next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. And again, we're back in the Queen's Building, room 103. That's going to be about big data and healthcare. And we have a debate between the person who's the Director General of Information Technology at the Department of Health and his counterpart from Estonia. You may remember last week I was talking about Estonia as the sort of model for e-government. So that will take place, as I say, next Tuesday at 7 o'clock, so please do come along to that. The second announcement is that Helen is very, very kindly going to, is very happy to carry on conversations after the talk. Unfortunately, there are no drinks this evening, okay, so those conversations have to take place in a dry environment up in the foyer, but please do approach Helen if you'd like to ask her anything about anything she's spoken about this evening. But please join me in thanking her for a fantastic talk. Thank you.